Good evening to our viewers from around the world, and welcome to our weekly CJL Fireside Chat. Tonight we have with us a special guest, a good friend, all the way from New York, or more accurately, I believe, Connecticut, Alicia Wiesel. Even if our audience are not familiar with you, as I hope they will be soon, no one could be unfamiliar with your surname, thanks to your dad. We'd be here all night if we tried to list his achievements, but to name a few. Obviously, he is known for being the Nobel Prize Laureate, recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and also, closer to home, an honorary knighthood from the Queen in, I believe, 2006. He is best known to many people, Jews from around the world, really young and old alike, and beyond, I must say, for being an author of more than 40 books, including the much celebrated Night, as I was just discussing with Alicia, something that most Jewish kids read and will continue to read for many, many years to come, which obviously brought the horrors of life at Auschwitz to the attention of so many. He also was a great campaigner. As one of his great quotes, I believe, something that made a strong impression on me and on many people, I think he said, the opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. He campaigned tirelessly, day and night, year in, year out, even in his later age, against prejudices and persecution, including in Kosovo and Sudan. He also enjoyed an enduring correspondence and personal relationship with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, if I may add, that tonight is Gimel Tammuz, the third day of the month of Tammuz, where thousands of his followers and beyond, many people, so many who were inspired by him, commemorate the day of his passing. I actually met your father, Elisha, on a few occasions. My father was a great friend of his for many, many years, beginning in the 70s when he brought him over to London to speak on many occasions, and read most of his books. He saw himself as a link in the chain between the past, the generation of old, and 20th century, 21st century. We have with us tonight, as I mentioned, Alicia Wiesel. Just a few words about him, an American businessman who worked for Goldman Sachs for, I believe, a quarter of a century. It's a long time. Ultimately serving as its chief information officer for 3 years until December 2019. He is married with 2 children. I believe one of them recently had bar mitzvah and currently resides in New York. So let's get straight into it. Obviously, a name that so many of us know. He was held in great esteem by the Jewish people and non-Jewish people around the world. I believe it was President Obama who once said regarding your father, he is the conscience of the world, one of the great moral voices of our time. He was described once as the most important Jew in America by the Los Angeles Times. So my question to you, Alicia, to start with is, how did he receive such plaudits? And why do you think he made, and continues, if I may say, to make such a profound impact on so many people, regardless of, let's just say, color or race?
Listen, first of all, thank you so much for allowing me to share an evening with you, Rav Vogel. And I would also say that, one of the things I'm sure we'll discuss is just how inspiring and what an interesting road it can be to be the son of a powerful personality. And nobody knows that, I think, better than you, with your father, Rav David Vogel, being such a great personality in the English Chabad world. So it's a real honor to get to be with you and your extended family tonight. Look, I think my father did not dwell on the plaudits. He was never somebody who felt comfortable, basking in achievements. I think for him, it was always, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? What's the next thing to do? And, it's very interesting because I had to really think about this when I was deciding ultimately what to put on his gravestone. What was the one thing he really aspired to be? What were was there any praise that really mattered to him? And it's his entire life. The one thing he always came back to in his conversations with me is that what mattered more than anything else was to be remembered as a good Jew.
Well, that's amazing. That's amazing. Put it very, very succinct. Obviously, we'll find out later on this evening what exactly is meant by a good Jew. There are a lot of different views and opinions about that. But obviously, we all, the wider community and society at large, knew him in certain ways. You had the privilege to know him in a different way, more intimately. If you can tell us a little about Elie Wiesel, the family man, father, husband, etc.
So, I think for my father, there was one principle above all else that reigned in the home, and that was the principle of shalom bayit, peace in the home. And, he was a man who showed incredible patience in all avenues of his life, but I am sure that we got on his nerves from time to time. I was a difficult kid, certainly growing up. We had, many different competing viewpoints on all things. It was always a dynamic environment in our home. And my father, there was one thing that just always came first. And if he and my mother had a disagreement, he would just defer to my mother. It is just very hard to remember him doing anything other than that. And for him, that principle of shalom bayis above all else was a dominating principle. And, that can lead to interesting dynamics when you have a young, rebellious teenage son growing up looking to, express themselves in all sorts of ways. It was always, how do I get back to shalom bayis so that my father could, be at peace and do the things he wanted to do.
Well, that's incredible and obviously inspiring. Yes, he did speak about tolerance a lot, so obviously applied at home too. What are your earliest recollections of your dad's lifelong efforts against discrimination? He was known for that.
Yeah.
You're a public figure. How do you remember that as a child or growing up?
But the early impressions are really of all sorts of people always coming through the house. There was always a trail of interesting people coming through the house, engaged on one matter of public affairs or another, whether it was, Moshe Dayan coming to have a dinner at our home, or whether it was Francois Mitterrand. There were, always people coming in and out. And what I remember from an early age was, trips to the camps, trip to Washington, D.C., the creation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I remember him being very active and engaged, and nobody ever really sat me down at any point and said, okay, Alicia, now I'm going to give you, Elie Wiesel 101 or, Holocaust for Dummies. Nobody ever did that. There was never a, child or age appropriate digestion of here's what's going on. It all had to sort of be picked up by osmosis and figuring out what was going on around me. I don't think my father wanted to discuss very directly when I was young, the matters in which he was engaged.
Well, that's very interesting. So obviously you were there as a witness. I remember seeing a picture of you on one occasion. Your father was sitting next to, I believe it was President Jimmy Carter. And as a young lap. I'm sorry?
And I'm on Jimmy Carter's lap.
Yes, okay. And you're trying to figure out why you, a simple boy, is sitting on Jimmy Carter's lap, right?
I had some idea it had to do with Judaism and history and my father having played an important role. But yeah, I did not have much of an idea at younger ages. I was just like, why am I missing out? All the other kids are getting to go play baseball on the weekends and we're jet setting around the world.
Okay. So obviously you're extremely proud of him. He's a special man. He's traveling the world. He's, he's educating, inspiring, telling stories. But was it ever difficult to have the name Wiesel? A man like that who achieved so much, who made such a profound impact on so many people, the expectation to be, brilliant in everything you do must have been huge. How did you deal with it?
It's a great question. And have I shared with you before the story of the Rebbi when he actually addressed this very issue?
No.
I'm happy to do that. It's look, things were very tense for me. I felt it as a great burden and as a great weight growing up. I felt it was very difficult for me to see how I was going to be myself under the shadow of my father. He was it wasn't that he was a huge personality. He didn't domineer me, but everybody else was always giving him so much kavod, and they would look at me and they say, oh, that's just, Elie Wiesel's son. And they would have all these expectations for how they expected me to behave or be, or what I would be interested in. And it led to a real strain. It led not only to, a desire for me to be distant from my parents for some time, but really more broadly distant from Yiddishkeit. So there was quite a while where I was really doing everything I could to remove myself. It's interesting, during that time when it was sort of very dark, when my relationship was very troubled with my father and with what I felt he represented, my father apparently went to the Rebbi for a bracha. Or I don't know if it was for a bracha or he just went to go see him. And the Rebbi gave him the following bracha. He said, "Don't worry," he said to my father, "one day you will be proud of him. Your son will be proud of you. And when that moment happens, you will both be proud of me." And that was the Rebbi's bracha.
Well, what a way, what a bracha. And if I can say, most of the Rebbe, when he says something, there's blessings, and here you are today. So, Alicia, no doubt, your father is proud of you, and the Rebbe is proud of you. That's amazingly inspiring. If I may say, you're lucky to get such a bracha from someone so special. Your father's exposure to the world was becoming increasingly prominent. You lived with that all your life, at various phases in your life. How did you forge, as you mentioned before, your own personality, your own ideology against that background of your father's shadows? And as you mentioned before, how did you navigate those tensions, that you were speaking about before?
It's a very long story, but I'll pick a couple of spotlights and you can guide me if you want to hear more. But first of all, my father really paved the way for that to happen. You have to understand, my father was not overbearing. And, as I look ahead and I think about how I'm raising my own children and the choices that I will have to make on what guardrails will I set for my own kids and how insistent will I be on various aspects of their maintaining Jewish identity. I realize what an incredibly, until one's a parent, one has no idea how complicated it is to be a parent. And my father, God bless him, he really, despite all of the pressure that he felt, that he was the sole survivor of, the sole male heir of his family, so desperately wanting to pass on Yiddishkeit, so desperately wanting it all to matter, that, Wiesel should continue davening and observing Shabbos or keeping kosher or whatever it was he wanted out of Jewish identity. He felt a lot of pressure and strain, and it consumed him that I wasn't, thinking in that direction. And, to his credit, he didn't push that hard. If I didn't want to go to shul, he wouldn't drag me to shul. If I didn't want to, do something, he had a couple of instances. I'd go to shul with him on, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. But other than that, there were really only two guardrails. One, I had to marry Jewish, and two, he wanted me to say Kaddish for him for the full year, for the 11 months after he passed. But other than that, there were not a lot of demands that he made on me. And I think in some sense, to answer your question, he created the space so that it wouldn't feel overly restrictive, so that I could go on, great departures, so that at age 14, I could turn to a circle of friends that was based on really the internet before there was an internet. I was one of these kids who was, hanging out in their room with a modem, these old modems making all those sounds you may remember, for those of you who are old enough, the dial-up sounds you would hear. And I would be texting with friends and chatting with friends long before there were, these forums to do so, before email was prevalent. And I was, I went very far afield. I had many friends, who were not Jewish. I learned about all sorts of aspects of the world. And when I went to college, I studied, something that didn't have anything to do with humanities or my father's work. I studied computer science and, I got very interested in computer games. So my father created the space for me to have the journey that, called to me.
Well, that's amazing. Obviously your father raised in Siget, a Vishnitzer Chassid, and brought up in that world. One of my favorite books was a book called Souls on Fire.
Yeah.
And obviously your father told stories better than most because I guess he came from that world. But I think it was an article that you wrote a few years ago when you mentioned a story with a Baal Shem Tov, where a father, if you want to just...
more, that one?
Yeah. Please remind us of that, coming from you who heard it from him.
It's a great story. It's the story of a father is very distressed that the son has turned from the faith. The son is turning his back on the history of his people, and he's in real agony. And he goes to the Besh and says, "What should I do?" And the Besh says, "Love him more." And those were the instructions.
Well, what amazing advice. Simple, but not easy.
Not easy.
Not easy. Okay, so moving away from that world, idyllic world, you're growing up. You've got to start your own life, and you're finished university. Get out there, get a job, etc., and entering the real world. So you took up employment with obviously Goldman Sachs, eventually becoming its chief information officer. At the time, obviously artificial intelligence, algorithms, substituting individual judgment. It's a different world from where you come from, as you just mentioned before. Were you comfortable in that environment, and where do you think all that is going?
So there's two questions. Was I comfortable in that environment? Exceedingly. I found the world of finance to be a world that has all of the challenges that one can ask for to make one grow professionally and personally. One cannot succeed in the business world if one does not know how to connect with people, and learning how to connect with people, to listen to them, to understand them, to work together as a team. These are skills I think that transcend any profession, and they can very much be found in that world of finance. And, you asked a little bit about, I think there's an insinuation there, or there's the hint of a question that, in the business world, does some of this modernization come at an ethical cost? Or are there ethical dilemmas that come as technology modernizes? And I think that's always the case. Is there is there ever a case where that doesn't happen? You look back to, if nothing more than the invention of the light bulb. The invention of the light bulb allows the existence of the factory, and the existence of the factory means that workers in the working class now could potentially be put to work for 14-hour days or 18-hour days, because when the sun goes down, you can't insist that the work is over. So all of a sudden, being overworked is tied to the technology of the light bulb. And now you have something different when, if software developers or credit policy analysts choose to describe who should get a loan and who should not get a loan, and they try to encode that in rules, and the rules are complex pieces of software that may have a hidden bias in them, that may not see the entirety of a person and their situation the way an old-fashioned credit analyst might if they were writing each loan one by one, face-to-face with a person who was seeking to borrow. You get to a different outcome. So I think, yes, with every new complexity, with every new technology, there's always some new ethical way in which that's going to challenge us. And I think we have to, we have to get smarter, and we have to be thoughtful and be prepared that we will make mistakes and be prepared to learn from them.
Well, that's obviously true, and very, very fast evolving. Let me ask you something. So you're in that new world, and evolving and establishing yourself. What's the nature of your relationship with your father in the context of your professional development? Do you talk to him? Does he take an interest? Do you talk to him about work, or is it just
my father? First of all, he was lovely. He was so proud of me for the career that I had, but he had no idea what I was doing. Really, honestly, no idea. We could go back to the beginning. We'd be like, okay, Dad, remember there's stocks, there's bonds, there's oil. Within the world of bonds, you have government bonds and corporate bonds. We would always sort of start from the beginning. And, the only thing that he was paying attention to, it didn't matter what I was saying. He just cared that I cared. He cared that I was excited about it. He cared that I was finding problems that I thought were worth solving, that I was making friendships that I thought were worth maintaining. These were the things that mattered to him. And he was very happy to see me successful. I think he was, his father was a businessman as well. My grandfather was a shopkeeper in Siget. Who was, probably more on the secular end. I mean, he was an Orthodox Jew, but more secular in terms of his view of the world and his running a business and then using that business to help others. So I think my father was just very proud, even if it wasn't his thing or he didn't really claim to understand it.
Well, that's obviously it's very beautiful to hear. And for most of us in the outside world, we didn't get to appreciate that side of him. He was out there talking, etc. But it's beautiful to see the humanity. That human being father-son relationship, and we thank you obviously for sharing that. When you were at Goldman, and I read about this at the time, you created a sort of some very interesting. It was quite complex,
Midnight.
Well, yeah, the scavenger hunt, bankers, hedge fund people raised many millions for causes each year, which obviously is a fantastic endeavor. Was this commitment to good causes and helping the less fortunate also inspired by your father? Tell us a little about what motivated you to do this sort of thing.
Well, listen, the backdrop of philanthropy to my growing up, you have to realize, comes not just from my father, but really also from my mother. It's really the two of them together that created a foundation after the Nobel to decide how to spend the Nobel money in a way that would help people. So really the concept of philanthropy is something I inherited from both my parents. My mother is still living. For me, the idea was, it was a confluence of a number of things. I always like to try to, if you will, hit two birds with one stone. And there were a number of things going on. Number one, I felt that the way philanthropy was being done was frankly boring. I couldn't go to another dinner, where it's the chicken or the sea bass, and you have 7 speeches and you hope they end on time, and maybe they do, maybe they don't. And yes, it's nice to see people, but it's a passive way of engaging with philanthropy, because you write a check and then you go and you consume some food, you consume some speeches, but you're not involved in any creative aspect. And I felt that there was a need to try to shake up how philanthropy was being done in New York in the Wall Street set. Separately, I felt that there was a very worthy charity that I had become attached to, which was doing fantastic work with, underprivileged kids in the New York area. And then the third thing that had happened, so it's really 3 birds with one stone, is I had been lucky enough to play a game that had been hosted for free by many years, that had been set up by these 2 enterprising young men. And they had stopped hosting it because they really couldn't afford to do it, but they didn't want to commercialize it. They didn't want to sell out. And I said, wow, what if I get these guys to resurrect it? We'll bring the game back. We'll change the way philanthropy is potentially done or can be done in the New York area. And we'll raise a lot of money for this very needy charity. And it was extremely successful. We really attracted attention, not only at Goldman, but really across all of Wall Street, from both the sell side and buy side. And the good news is it's lived on. There's actually a London version of it that has continued.
Okay.
There's a group called Raise Your Hands, which does similar work in the London area, working with smaller nonprofits that focus on youth. And they called and they asked if I would be okay with them starting a London version of it. And they did. And I helped connect them with some of the talent. And it's been running now for a few years, and it's also quite successful.
Well, that's fantastic. That's the ripple effect, and it moves on and on and on, and we hope that grows from strength to strength. So moving on, obviously, your father was a Holocaust survivor, a young boy. He lost his father, he lost his mother, he lost his sister, and that was obviously very much a part of his life. So I believe he helped establish the U.S. Holocaust Museum.
Yeah.
And in your, you as evolving and you, I believe, spoke, there on occasion, talking about your father and his legacy.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you like this: as an only child, do you feel a particular responsibility to continue passing on his message? And how have you personally been able to do so?
So the answer is yes, but maybe not in the way you expect. For me, I see that there's a responsibility and then there's a possibility. The responsibility that is front and center in terms of passing on my father's legacy, and I have no doubts about this whatsoever, is 100% consumed with my children and how I raise them. And my father's legacy in that regard means that they should be raised to be confident, well-read, but most importantly to my father, with a sense of Jewish identity. And that to me is, I feel, the number one obligation. And if I did nothing else in my life but raise two kids who, who when they grow on to have their own kids and their own families, they have a Shabbat dinner table and they sing Zmiros and they do Havdalah on Saturday night. If I do nothing else than that, I will feel that I 100% honored my father's legacy as he would have wanted to. Now, beyond that, one of the things that struck me after my father passed was that there were many people who felt the void of my father and that who missed him very much and felt that there were things he was saying that needed to be said in new ways because we have new environments and new circumstances. And there is a possibility that I may be of help. So from time to time, I publish articles. I've written pieces in everything from the Financial Times to the Allgemeiner or Jewish Journal, a relatively wide range, depending on the topic. And I do sometimes feel I have something to say. And when I do, I sit down and I either write it or I say it.
Alicia, that's inspiring, certainly for many of our viewers, because sometimes many people who are involved in communal work, they have to weigh and sometimes make sacrifices. And if I can just say and share with you a yechidot, a private audience that my father had with the Rebbi many, many years ago, is when he came in, I think this was in the 60s, he came in with a list of a whole range of topics, obviously important communal affairs. And the Rebbe looked at the entire list, many pressing questions, and pushed it aside, looked my father in the face and said, but the most important thing you forgot.
How's your mishpacha?
How's your family doing? How are the kids doing? So again, I think you got it spot on. And from that growth and from the strength of that continuity, I'm sure everything else in continuing the father's legacy will certainly, no doubt, follow. There's a great deal of focus in this country and around the world on preserving the memory of the Shoah. Obviously, once survivors are no longer with us. In Britain, I know we have the support of successive governments, and I'm sure in America too. And they're talking about a national memorial in Westminster, etc. So my question is, are you confident that enough is being done around the world at this stage in the game to ensure that the memory of the Holocaust is kept alive?
You see, to me, there's two parts to it. Is society's need to remember what happened in the Shoah to make sure it doesn't happen again appropriately met? And I think that that's a very important question. And look, I think the fact that there is a U.S. Holocaust Museum is a very powerful thing in the States. And I think that there should be something equivalent to that in the UK. I've heard mixed messages as to whether or not the Westminster Project is proceeding or not. I very much hope something is ultimately created. I know that with the War Museum, I think there are certain wings that are, that have either been up as exhibits or there's been talk of a permanent exhibit. I do think that there has to be a good understanding of it. I mean, it's amazing to me that in a country like the United Kingdom, a man like Jeremy Corbyn can almost be elected to prime minister, get within a stone's throw, when you look at the aggregated body of evidence of everything that he said, and you say, really, did this, is it possible that this man didn't learn how easy it is to hate the Jews and how important it is to not do that? So yes, I have concerns, but I think in terms of memory, and I don't want to overly harp on this, so I'll be brief. I think as important to my father that the lessons of the Holocaust be preserved were that what came before the Holocaust should be preserved. The Jewish way of life, as much of shtetl life as can be remembered, the language of Yiddish, the songs and the prayers, the thought of a Jewish identity that could transcend all these different aspects of the diaspora and yet remain a united people. I think these were, if not as important to him, if not more important, as important to him in terms of what memory really meant.
That's very, very, very insightful. If I may say, that's not what is overtly conveyed as his message and his legacy.
Yep.
So, as you say, we focus on that cutoff, that tragedy, that dark moment, the Holocaust. But obviously, the tragedy is that world, to a certain extent, was lost, and the greatest response, as you said, is to rebuild that. So So, how do you think? And obviously, you're a son here, bearing that, if I may say, responsibility, privilege. How do we convey more of that part of that transition, that continuity, to be more a part of your father's legacy than is otherwise recognized?
Look, I think one has to remember that there are books other than Night, and I think that that's part of the answer. You have to you have to listen to his lectures, and I'm working with areas like the 92nd Street Y to try to put the archive of his lectures, because he spoke there for decades on all manner of Hasidic topics, and we're trying to get those online, transcripts, the audio, so that people can hear what he was talking about. But the important thing is to also remember, aside from what he wrote and said, look at what he did. My father lived an ethical life. My father lived according to Jewish values. And for those who had the privilege of meeting him, and for those who can talk to those who met him, what universally comes across is a man who, no matter how busy he was, no matter how many heads of state were calling him or important meetings were summoning him, if the taxi driver had a story to tell him about where he came from in Senegal and what he experienced there, or a man from Argentina who bumps into him on the street and decides he has to tell him a part of his life story, my father would stop and he would listen to the story that the person had to say. He would be a witness to what they had to say, because he lived with derech eretz. He lived with a Jewish set of values for how to engage with other people. And for those who met him and spent time with him, it's unforgettable. And I think that those people who spent time with him, sharing those stories of how he operated as a man, as a human being, and then you think about the decisions that he made, that after what happened in the Shoah, he decided, forget the fact that he wore tefillin, but he every day for the rest of his life, but he went and decided to raise a Jewish family after the devastation that occurred to him. The choices that he made in life, I think, speak louder than any of his other words or speeches about who he was as a Jew and the importance of memory and remembering all that came before the Shoah and continuing it forward.
Look, Alicia, that's wonderful to hear. And, we encouraged you on that project that you spoke about originally to get that all transcribed, a collection of the audio, visual. You were head of technology at Goldman, so you know a little bit about that. But yes, that is really, in a way, more inspiring because in terms of who he was, and he loved those stories and he told those stories. I remember being once at a lecture in New York City. It was in the 80s, and I was there with a bunch of friends. And I remember he said something which really summed him up in the way that you are. And he said, "Who I am is what I learned in Siget, not what I learned in the Sorbonne." And I think that's a very revealing statement, and obviously what you're saying. So certainly, if you can get that out there, it would be.
But I don't want to. This is important. I don't want to take away. See, my father had two important strands of thought: the universalist and the particular. And I would never want someone to say, "Oh well, Elie Wiesel, really he was so interested in Jewish memory, there's no application for the rest of the world." No, my father felt very strongly that to be a good Jew, which I mentioned earlier is the legacy he cared most about, meant engaging with the world. It meant understanding other faiths. It meant understanding what we have in common with everyone, the mistakes we make and the wondrous things we can do when our better angels have control of our nature. So the universal is incredibly important to him, and he cared deeply that the lesson of the Holocaust, which he felt was a uniquely Jewish event, had to never be repeated in any other part of the world, which is why, as you mentioned in your introduction, he traveled, whether it was to Bosnia, whether he spoke up about Rwanda, all of these places, he felt there were universal messages to take away. And yet, he very much, everything he did was rooted in the particulars of who he was as a Jew. And, this is important because I had many arguments with him when I was growing up. And I'd say, "Okay, Dad, you say you want to be a good Jew. Well, what about me? If you had to choose, would you rather that I end up being good, or would you rather that I end up being Jewish? What's more important in that phrase? Break it apart for me, good Jew." And he said, "Alicia, you're getting me wrong. For a Jew, the only way that he can be good is to be a good Jew. It's part of who he is. You can't turn your back on it. And if I have Muslim friends, the only way that they can reach their full potential is to embrace their past and their history. And for my friends who are Christian, they should learn from their faith, and my Buddhist friends should learn from where they come from. I'm not saying that one is better than the others by any stretch of the imagination, but we are part of a story, and that story goes on for thousands of years, and that's our faith, and we should embrace it and learn what we can from it. And the same is true for everyone else who has a rich history that their parents have bequeathed to them.
Well, that's fantastic. And the truth is that fundamentally, if we think about it, the universal focus is not a contradiction to the particular.
He never saw it as a contradiction.
Exactly, they complement each other. So moving on to, you just mentioned Jewish identity and continuity, and obviously, as you mentioned before, this was his big thing. This is continuity. This is what it's all about. As a matter of fact, the Holocaust is just a manifestation of that concern. So assimilation, as we all know, is one of the main greatest threats facing our people today in Europe, in America, and indeed around the world. First of all, were you, as a young man, confident that you would meet that challenge? And you mentioned that before, but how, if you can just elaborate on that, how did it actually evolve?
I went to a modern Orthodox yeshiva growing up. I went to all the way from nursery school through to senior year of high school. I was at a yeshiva. I had Talmud classes. I had I had Hebrew classes. We learned Tanakh. Davening every morning, that was part of my identity until age 18. When I went to college, I was done. I didn't go to Hillel once. I just stayed far away. I didn't keep Shabbos. I didn't keep kosher, not anything, not a little bit. I'd go home for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur because my father was clear that mattered. And I would sit there in shul and I would try to meditate, or, I actually would sneak in a book from time to time in my machzor. I'd bring in whatever I had to read for class, or, if it was small enough, or something that would interest me, maybe Borges, maybe some Plato. And I would read during services. So I was extremely assimilated. I was dating, almost exclusively non-Jewish women. But I was mindful of the fact that my father had told me this is a line you can't cross. At some point when you're getting ready to marry, you have to marry Jewish. And he made clear that conversion would be accepted. If somebody, converted to halacha, that would be acceptable to him. But that was the very one big guardrail. So for me, I was very distant. I have to say I was extremely, extremely far.
Well, that's obviously it's a remarkable story, and no doubt your father, in his way, got his way.
He did.
He did, and obviously he, certainly deserved it.
Israel was a big part of it.
Okay, that's good to hear.
When I was in college, near the end of my college experience, I reconnected with my father's sister's son, my first cousin. Okay. And I got to see, by spending time in Israel with people who were closer to my contemporaries, I got to really see a little bit of living Judaism in a way that I feel like I hadn't seen otherwise.
That's even though you were living in New York City.
I was living in New York, but you have to remember, I grew up in a partially assimilated family. My mother, came from a much more secular family, and she tolerated, in some sense, the Judaism that my father wanted to pursue. And kids are smart. Kids pick it up when the parents aren't on the same page. That definitely opens up a gap. But when I went to Israel and I spent time with my cousin Steve there, and I got to have a bit more of a role model for what does it mean to be like a living, breathing, modern Jew. This was somebody who I could joke with, who, was much more culturally relevant and knew the things I was talking about, and we got along, and we, and yet he, he was working on an army base and some amazing unit, and, he carries around his Memshesh Esrei, or his pistol. He was already an officer at that time, and he's defending the Jewish people, in their state of Israel. And at the same time, he's davening every day, and he cares about halacha, and he's urging me to wear tefillin. And all of a sudden I saw the possibility of Judaism within my own blood that had survived past my father's generation. And it shook me up a little bit. It said, wow, my father doesn't have to be the last.
Right, that's amazing. So in a way, it was a sort of peer-to-peer influence.
Yeah, he's older than him, but yeah, more peer-to-peer.
Now, moving on, obviously, you spoke about your children before, and they seem to be your pride, and I'll quote you on that, and you're on your Facebook Live, so your children can quote you on that, 100% dedication to your children. And you're right, because it's all about the children, it's all about the continuity. So even if you are working wherever, at Goldman or etc., that's just the means to the ends, which is the children and the values you want to impart on them. I saw pictures, by the way, that you posted on Facebook. Your father's yahrzeit, I believe, was last week. And
That's right.
obviously, we wish you long life and
Thank you.
Mazarei b'chaim afhu b'chaim, and just as his children are alive, so is he alive. And Alicia, certainly you, and now your son, Bar Mitzvah. I saw him in the tefillin also. You posted something on that. Hair a little longer than yours, than mine, but there you are. So let me ask you a question about that. Are your children, and this is the third generation, are they showing any signs of wanting to, continue that legacy? And what do you think your father means to your children?
It's a great question. First of all, they remember him as a grandfather who loved them. So that's their primary memory. But the day my father passed is the day my son, who is now 14, at the time he was 10, that's the day he picked Night Up off the shelf and read it cover to cover. He wears tefillin every day. Will he keep doing it when he's 18 and out of my house? I don't know. But for now, it's our father-son time. He doesn't go to a Jewish school. So we make, 10 minutes in the morning every morning, daven together. It's a very quick davening. We, put on our tefillin. We say the Birchas HaShachar, Shema, Shmona Esrei. We have it's a quick accelerated davening, but we do it together. And that's sort of our moment. And hopefully he remembers that and it sticks with him. And, does he? Yes, his social justice is important to him. I found out recently that he has all sorts of handles on social media that I hadn't been aware of. And he basically describes himself as a liberal Zionist. So he's advocating both for liberal causes, but then he takes up arms if the liberals that he commingles with, come close in any way to anti-Zionism, he lets them have it. Now he has to be careful on social media, but I was kind of proud to see that this is where he's doing when I'm not watching. And my daughter, she is very close to she goes to a Jewish school and she loves the Yiddishkeit that she's getting there, and she gets into it with Tanakh, gets very excited about all the stories she's learning. So yeah, I think it continues.
That's fantastic, and obviously, holding Israel, being proud of as a Jew and Israel on social media, front lines, which is very vicious, is certainly, I believe, fulfilling your father's. I think his quote was something about indifference is evil, and there was nothing Israeli, obviously, through his experience. So your son standing up to anyone who would challenge Israel or the Jewish people, I think that he's being trained young.
That said, I've been trying to explain to him that one doesn't really win fights on Facebook or on social media. You don't really, rarely will you ever really persuade somebody to see something differently, unfortunately.
Okay, but it's a bit of a testing ground.
Yeah.
You mentioned previously that he asked you to say Kaddish every day after his passing, and you did. As a matter of fact, when you were with us a couple of years ago, you said Kaddish. I believe then it was the yahrzeit of his mother and his sister.
That's
it was a very, very special moment. So you said Kaddish. How can you just explain how, obviously you managed to say Kaddish. How was that experience for you in terms of, connecting and dealing with his passing?
I mean, Kaddish is this amazing, mysterious thing when one is mourning for a parent. It's almost harder to say. It's the act of having to figure out where you're going to say Kaddish every day. That incredible time scheduling. Where am I going to be then? How do I say it here? How do I say it there? How am I going to get a minyan? Is it meant to distract one from the morning, or is it meant to actually really immerse one in the morning? Because when you say Kaddish and you praise God's name at this, very dark moment in one's life, is it a meaningful and introspective? I don't know that anybody has the answers on this. But it's this thing that one does to honor a memory, and the belief is that in the afterlife, if you read the ancient texts on where Kaddish comes from, that the soul is in a state of limbo where it can be, punished for the things it's done wrong. And when a son comes and says Kaddish for the father, or for a parent, you are averring, you are deferring any bad judgments, and you are showing that whatever else the person may have done wrong on the planet, they raised a child who comes and says Kaddish for them, and that counts very highly in the heavenly court. And pain is stopped. And over time, the idea is that once the soul has moved on after the year has passed, at the yard site, and in general with all of the mitzvahs that one does, but particularly on the yard site, the phrase that Orthodox Jews say to each other is, "May the neshama have an aliyah, may the soul go higher, may you raise it, even higher into higher levels of holiness." I have to tell you, doing Kaddish for a full year, at first I had thought that my father was asking me to do it for him. And I think what I realized maybe a few weeks in is that actually it was his gift to me.
That's remarkable. That's remarkable, which is obviously a testament to the way I think your father brought you up in general. When you were young, when any child's young, they think he's doing it for himself. But as you get older, you realize that he's doing it for you. So that is remarkable that it was transmitted to his children, and obviously those values to your children too.
It was also a great way to experience lots of different shuls. Because you get around and the great thing about it is then you find one or two or three that click. And then all of a sudden, for the first time in my life, I'm like, wow, actually, this is what being in shul is meant to feel like. I actually feel connected to these people. I feel more spiritual, because who knows, maybe the shul where one was raised was just not the right fit.
No, certainly there has to be a special connection there. We mentioned earlier that tonight we commemorate the passing of the Rebbi, the Lubavitcher Rebbi, 3rd of Tammuz. How would you describe? Obviously, he's known, and I know he spoke many, many times at events organized by Chabad and non-Chabad around the world. I remember when he would get up there, he would talk about him not being a Lubavitcher Chassid, him being a Vizhnitzer Chassid. But nevertheless, he did have a very special relationship with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. How would you describe that relationship? And what impact do you think that the Rebbe had on his life?
I think they were friends, but I think my father deeply respected the Rebbe and what he stood for, and the life's work that he'd undertaken. It's funny, I found an old video of my father out in, I think, Dallas, Texas, some Chabad event, some maybe 30, 40 years ago. My father opened it by telling a story. He said, in every part of the world, what's amazing about Chabad, no matter some forlorn pocket of the world, somehow Chabad manages to send a shliach there. And you know what the first thing is that the shliach does when he gets there? He invites me to speak. So that was his relationship with Chabad. Deep appreciation for what the Rebbe and what Chabad were doing. And I think, sorry, you have another question.
No. Go ahead. You want to finish off that thought?
I was going to say, if one wants to think about the Rebbe and know what sort of a person he was, I think, again, we talked about how you can look at what someone said during their lifetime, you can look at their actions, but I think you have to look at the children of the Rebbe. And the Rebbe didn't have his own children. All of Chabad were his children. And I tell you, as I've traveled the world and I've had to make minyan for Kaddish or otherwise in far-flung pockets of the world, and there's always been a Chabad there to receive me, I have never met someone unfriendly in Chabad. I have never met someone pessimistic. I have never met a Chabad shliach family where the table wasn't warm and open, and there was miros, there was conversation, and there was interest in the world around them. So I think you have to look at the children of the Rebbe if one wants to understand what an amazing person he was. You just have to look at Chabad, and I think the answer is there.
No, that's certainly true, and that his legacy, his teachings, his inspiration continue to grow. I just today I went on the you can go on Google and do a few searches, and this is what I found in terms of his relationship. So this is something that he said in one of the interviews. He said, "The greatest bouquet of flowers I have ever received was from the Rebbe for my wedding. He was nudging me to get married. And then he said the following, which I thought was remarkable, beautiful. He said, I have many letters from him, one letter in which we speak about Jewish theology, 8 pages about theology. At the very end of the letter, he writes, and by the way, Elie, when are you getting married?
Always. In all the letters that I have many of these letters, not many, but I have a collection of the letters that the Rebbe sent my father. And they're amazing because they, there's one of them where he says to my father, if you really are so committed to defeating Hitler and everything that he stood for, the only way you can do it is that you should have children and grandchildren, who grow up to be Jewish. And he said, I'll even forgive you if they're not Chabad. Okay, they'll be Vishnitzer. That's good enough for me.
Look, if I may say, the Rebbe was very involved and encouraged all the people, and especially your father. So, in a way, if I may say, Alicia, you're one of those children of the Rebbe. In the encouragement to your father. You mentioned a bunch of letters that you have from your father, written from the Rebbe to your father. Are those letters published? And
they're not published. They're part of his private archive that I've been trying to put together over the last few years. I would love to see the letters that my father wrote to the Rebbe, but they're, I think, at 770, and I think there's a policy that so many people poured their hearts out to the Rebbe that those letters will never be disclosed. So I have despaired of ever seeing the other side of that correspondence. But I do have the letters, or many of them, that the Rebbe wrote to my father.
Would you consider ever publishing those letters or parts of those letters?
I don't know about it. I would consider it. I would think about it. We used one of them as the front piece for my son's bar mitzvah venture.
Oh, wow. Beautiful. Beautiful. I must say the last line of that interview in relation to the comment that I just made was, so there's long theological discussions, and then at the very end, he writes about your father getting married, and then your father adds the following comment, which I'd say this is your father par excellence. He says, as if the two had something in common.
Well, talk about two having something in common. There were 3 people who were nudging my father to get married. One of them was the Rebbe. The second was Shaul Lieberman of JTS, and I think you'd be hard pressed. They were very different people. Shaul Lieberman was the classic, misnagid, right? He was not Hasidic by any stretch of the imagination. Very by the book and deep into textual analysis of the Greek history that underpins the Talmud and the Mishnah. And then you had my mother. So, 3, what do these 3 people really have in common other than they were all nudging my father, he should get married?
Well, that's a great team effort. And obviously you're a product or a result of that endeavor. So we thank them. Let's move on. Obviously, there's lots going on in the world. It's nice to talk about the past and the future, but there's real challenges facing all of us around the world, especially in New York City. So we've suffered the double whammy. You've got the pandemic, and in America now, the racial tensions all over, not seen, I believe, since the 60s. Something's happening in the world, something's happening in America. How seriously, and you touched upon this before we went live, how seriously do you take these challenges?
Look, I'm not a doctor, so I won't comment on the pandemic other than, we as a family are doing all the things that, the medical establishment dictates. We wear masks, we social distance, we've been quarantining. But I will talk a bit about the racial injustice thing, because I think there is a thing there that has at times divided the Jewish community. I think that when I talk to friends, I feel some are torn, some are very clear. No matter what, we have to support any minority that feels that, police are treating them unfairly, and they have evidence of police brutality, and you have videos like you saw with George Floyd, and we have to do what, Abraham Heschel said, and we have to pray with our feet and get out there and demonstrate with them. I also have friends who say, how can you support Black Lives Matter? How can you ever put that on a sign? You look at the movement for Black Lives in 2016, and they made Free Palestine a plank of their posture, and they made it very clear that they tie Israel up in all this and their battle against, the white majority. And they spread things about how it's Israelis that are training, United States cops on how to put the knee hold on someone's throat. And they say terrible things. And I think we're caught in this terrible place because the political split in our country right now, and I suspect it's true elsewhere in the globe, is so deep that those who are on the left are so consumed with tearing down the injustice that they see towards blacks, gays, transgender, that, if a little bit of anti-Semitism creeps in there, so be it, the message is more important. And then there are those who say, wow, how can I ever support a cause that has an anti-Zionist component to it? Very troubling. I don't know that there is an easy answer, but the answer may not be one or the other. The answer may be both. I think when we see, people of dark skin mistreated, that, a young teenage black male has to worry and that his parents have to worry when he goes out, because if he gets pulled over by a traffic stop, that could mean the end of his life. We have to care about that. It wouldn't be Jewish not to. And we have to say something and we have to speak up. And if there are certain voices, within the group that are asking for change in that regard, who have an anti-Zionist or an anti-Semitic component to it, we have to find them where they are and we have to challenge them. And we have to not cede that ground. My worry is that if we cede the ground and we say, okay, you know what, that's just the province of the pure lefties, only they are going to protest, then we lose voices of reason within that community. And that's a terrible thing. I think that the black community and Jewish community goes so far back. Over half the civil rights movement lawyers, were Jewish. That we should have a falling out, I think, is crazy now. And we have to do everything we can to keep our voice in that dialogue.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you say that. I saw the other day a clip. I think it was a congressman who met the Rebbi in the early 90s, just after the Crown Heights riots. And the Rebbi indeed, talks about that, the common experience that we both had, and certainly we should be closer to each other.
He said there aren't two groups of New Yorkers. He said we're all New Yorkers. There's only Americans. He was very clear.
Exactly. There's no two sides. We're all one side. Okay, we're running out of time, and there's so much more to discuss. But finally, we talk about the future. You talk about your children. We talk about legacy. We talk about your father's legacy, who made such a profound impact, had such a profound impact on so many people, and through his books and his teachings. And please God, your efforts in those. I'm looking forward to reading and hearing and seeing.
Thank you, Rebbi. Thank you.
All those beautiful stories. Your father spoke about stories. I think he mentions. I've got a quote here at the end where he says something to the effect that God made man because he loves stories. And your father was one of the great storytellers, and I highly recommend all the books, but I particularly like The Souls on Fire. I mean, he told stories that I heard before, but in ways that I hadn't heard before. So that's certainly a great thing. And his story, there's much to choose from, but what are you most proud of your dad?
I'm just proud that he was my dad. There's not a lot more. I mean, I think we've covered a lot of ground tonight, and I think ultimately I'm most proud of the way my father conducted himself as a human being, and I think it's that I most seek to emulate. Every time I'm about to get angry at someone or snap at someone, maybe 2 out of 10 of those times I catch myself, and it's because I say, how would my father have handled that situation? And he wouldn't have yelled, he wouldn't have humiliated, he wouldn't have sought to belittle someone to make a point. He would have, in his quiet way, have found ways to de-escalate a tense situation with humor or with love or with patience.
Yeah, well, tolerance and patience are incredibly important traits, not so prevalent amongst the young generation. Finally, if I may say, what message would you like this young audience to take away, and what can they do to continue his legacy?
Remember that there were 2 parts to my father's message. Make sure the tragedy of the Holocaust is never repeated, but also take what is worth keeping in Jewish practice, of which there is a great deal to be found, and take the time to study it and learn it and immerse yourself in it. And if one shul doesn't do it for you, go to the next one, try a different flavor. If one book isn't grabbing you, ask for a recommendation and try a different one. But but don't give up on Judaism.
Alicia, thank you so much for coming tonight and joining us. We wish you to continue that legacy. Mazare b'chaim afu b'chaim, just as his children are alive, so is he alive. And I just want to give you a personal blessing, because the ultimate blessing is nachas from the children. And I remember many years ago, I met this Israeli guy, and he said, Rabbi, I'm not religious. I'm not even sure I believe in God. But to me, Judaism means one thing. And that is, before I make any big decision in my life, I ask myself one question. And that is, will this make my grandfather smile? So, Alicia, please God, you should continue making your father smile and proud. And we wish you that your son will also ask himself that question and continue to make his grandfather and you smile.
Amen. And everybody on this call and the Vogel family should all know only simchas and have a much health in the coming weeks.
Amen. Alicia, thank you. Stay safe and stay well. Thank you again.
Take care.